I believe that I will go ahead and get started because people usually continue to come on for the first couple of minutes. Welcome to the eighth CRC Roundtable, our monthly virtual seminar series. Again, our intention is to host targeted, inclusive, and informed conversations. The webinars are designed for contribution, not consumption, so that each webinar invites a diverse range of researchers, managers, other professionals to have conversations around critical topics, intended to build connectivity between all of us and really increase our collective competency for decision making. As a reflection of that intent, our three panelists today have been given about 15 minutes each to make some introductory remarks, and allowing a full 30 minutes for discussion. And this really is all about us, giving a place to ask the clumsy questions and to practice the bravery and humility necessary for building the future that we want. At each of these webinars, I've begun by answering the question of why this topic at this time by these speakers. As for this topic, it is the week of Earth Day, a time when we really try to rumble and reckon with questions of our individual and collective impact, the relationship between humans and the planet at scales from local to global, and how to change ourselves, our society, and our planet. And so the topic of caretakers of our waters, and by that I mean all waters, is a natural one. Why this time? Because we are at a unique moment in environmental action. And I'm going to quote one of our panelists, Karen Bislin, who has turned me on to the phrase that what got us here will not necessarily get us to where we want to be. Why these speakers? Each has a long history of caretaking, all at different scales and dimensions. They have the length of experience that includes moments of realization and pivot. And those are the stories that we need to hear to get positioned for what is to come. Let me tell you a little bit about each one of them because this is a unique event. Fred Tutman is a Patuxent riverkeeper. He's enjoyed a broad and varied career in media, civic advocacy, law, and legal education. And if you check out his Facebook site, he has a wonderful legacy of written pieces and photographs that provide insight into his values and his work. His most recent passion for environmental justice and community advocacy is really the trail that led us to him. Carl Hirschner of VIMS is recently retired, or he's trying to retire. He's not actually doing a very good job of it, Carl, from his position as director of the Center for Coastal Resources Management and professor of marine science. He continues to be one of those rare scientists that directs his prodigious curiosity and commitment to important questions, not just interesting ones, but important ones. Karen Bislin from the Chesapeake Bay program is the branch chief of Partnerships and Accountability branch of US EPA and is responsible for coordinating a real herd of cats, federal, state, and local actions to improve water quality, habitat, and living resources. And the operative word in her title is partnership, and that concept is at the heart of what makes the watershed restoration unique and particularly challenging. Most of all of these speakers, in my experience, are truth tellers, those brave enough to look their experience and the challenge in the eye. And with that, let me turn over the virtual floor to Fred Tutman to kick us off. Friend, I'll try and gently remind you when we're at about 15 minutes. And with that, the floor is yours.
I guess my task is to explain a little bit about Patuxent Riverkeepers' lens and our work. We are a grassroots advocacy organization on a particular river that has a very impressive history of citizen advocacy. It is the river that produced eventually the Chesapeake Bay program, actually, that the momentum of citizen advocacy on the Patuxent River, the state's longest and deepest intrastate river, sometimes called the most studied river in America, other times called Chesapeake Bay in miniature. Our work is as an advocacy organization, but we also mentor community-based advocacy, because really those are durable seeds that get planted, and that the rallying cry around much of this is, quite frankly, passionately about justice because we think that's a stronger organizing theme than the rallying cry of science. Justice is a little more potent, we find. And so we work where the worst problems are to be found in our watershed, which naturally takes us into the mobile home parks and into communities of color and to places with really intractable, vexing problems that have been with us for a long time. We believe that if we tackle those problems, the lesser problems of the watershed will seem less severe. So maybe I should leave it there for now, but that's the essence of what Patuxent Riverkeeper is about. We work on this tributary that drains to the Chesapeake Bay, and we rally people around the idea of stewardship and connection to the river and preserving the cultural history of the river and retaining the self-determinism of the communities along the river as well. Thank you.
Fred, did you want to say a little bit about through your experience and the arc of your work, what have been moments when maybe you've shifted your focus or shifted the focus of your work?
Well, at various times, I found myself talking out of both sides of my mouth when it came to talking to different ethnic groups, right? When I talk to, let's say, white communities that have a history of bay saving and connection to the environment, the messaging and the substance of what I talk about and need to talk about in those places is a little different than what I find in communities of color, where there's inherent cynicism about the system, no attempt to appease funders or the establishment systems, and a history of struggle associated with virtually everything they have. And frankly, the interconnection between social justice and the environment, which is less commonplace, I find, in whiter communities, where people can just talk about nature. They don't really have that sense that nature is something adversarial or that the system's out to deny them things. So these are really different movements, and I frankly try to connect them as best I can. I think that's an important connection to make, because I don't think we're on the same page. I think people of color and people who are white sometimes in these movements are having totally different environmental experiences, and so they're not really working on the same things.
Can you maybe talk about your, I'd say, how you came to be working so hard in the area of civic advocacy, right? So has that been a part of your work from the beginning, or did that kind of happen to you at some point in your experience where you went, I need to work at this scale to make this connection?
Well, I worked in a career for 25 years, television and radio, where I didn't necessarily control my time all the time. The news stories and assignments controlled my time. But when I had time, I was a community activist. So long before I was Patuxent Riverkeeper, I was an active participant in my rural community, where frankly, we're chasing off all kinds of harebrained schemes that people wanted to put out in the boondocks where we live. My family lives on a family farm. It's been in the family about 100 years. And so there was the family tradition was fighting off unwanted uses in the community. I ran a civic association in my home community, and on her deathbed, the head of the civic association, Ellen Chambers, said, "Don't let the civic association die." And eventually, the civic association work morphed into what later became Patuxent Riverkeeper, as I made the connection between my desire to make a career change. I didn't want to work in television and radio anymore because we couldn't fix anything we saw. We were covering these news stories about the environment, and we couldn't do a darn thing about them except talk about them. And I wanted to get my hands dirty. I wanted to get involved in it. So yeah, there was a point in time where I decided to divest my involvement in the old career and invest myself in these communities. And I've never looked back since. It's exciting work because there's so much richness in these communities, and they really do want to save this river. And so, trying to capture that and trying to fashion that into a on the ground movement, there's 3 lifetimes of work to be found on the Patuxent River.
So, and how did basically the previous experience in television and radio sort of inform the work that you do now in sort of the civic advocacy? Were there?
That's funny too, because the media industry has changed a lot. When I was involved, I started in the 1970s, and in those days we actually had to be pretty wily. We had to go out and get the news. And so we learned to think on our feet, and we were aggressive. Putting aside for a minute that I got adept at garnering media coverage for Patuxent Riverkeeper, I also learned as an investigative reporter how to piece together the facts and how to be undaunting in our pursuit of the truth. Actually, and the other side of it too, is that the money streams are a little complicated if you're running a grassroots movement. I was a contractor for all those 25 years. I was used to not having a steady paycheck. And so the financial challenges were not as daunting for me. As strange, maybe I should leave it there, but I guess what I'm saying is that I think for some people who are looking for a viable business model, I'm not convinced that activism is a business model. I think it's activism, which does come with some financial sacrifices, but
Yeah.
it liberates our voice. I think that's important too, that we're not beholden to any funder. We're accountable to the communities we serve.
And does that, how important is that experience in knowing how to garner media attention or messaging important to the civic work that you do?
Well, it's certainly true that whoever has the better narrative has a better chance of prevailing. And there's some great narratives. There's some great stories. Actually, I like to say there's a million stories on the Patuxent. Some of them are even true. But that said, it's true. That is the work that we essentially do to activate the community's voice. We give the community a voice through our media outreach, through various other tactics and techniques that we use as well. But at the end of the day, the idea is that these are communities that have their own voice. The work's not about us. The community owns the work at the end of the day. And I think that's also important as far as planting those seeds of activism. The term that I was given by one of the deans of the early Patuxent movement was keeping the pilot light on. And that's what we see ourselves doing. We're keeping that pilot light lit up as best we can, because I do think citizen action is what holds the system accountable, potentially.
And how does that, specifically in Patuxent River Keepers, how does that show up? How does that accountability show up? How does the pilot light, what's the pilot light look like, right?
It looks like vigilant citizens, citizens who are sometimes litigating, activating, pursuing administrative law cases in zoning matters in their home community, people falling in love with something in their watershed and fighting like heck in order to preserve it and protect it. It takes the form of an organization that's heavily staffed by volunteers. Patuxent Riverkeeper draws pretty heavily on these communities that we work with that do the actual work on the ground. That's who runs the office. That's who answers the phone. So it's, we have some working staff, paid staff, but mostly, like I said, it's a community clubhouse. It's unique, actually. There's actually a clubhouse on the Patuxent River that is a home for advocacy, and all are welcome. And frankly, we're bringing new ideas, fresh blood. I think it's an extraordinary thing.
So that sounds like, and maybe just kind of to finish up by talking about what you see getting ready for the future looks like. I mean, is it true in your case that what got you here isn't going to get you there? Or, I mean, and when you talk about new ideas and new potential and growing, what's the challenge going into the future?
I think the challenge is distinguishing work that is transformative, that actually changes broken systems. And there's a lot of systemic problematic stuff happening in these watersheds. Public hearings where no one's actually listening at the hearing, zoning and other matters that are utterly dominated by private real estate interests and others. If you can't discern the change-based movements from the ones that simply keep the motor turning, we will be chasing clean water till the end of time, to be honest with you. So I believe that these are fundamental movements in terms of ground truthing what's really gone wrong in these watersheds. And the accountability factor, I think, is what keeps that pilot light alive. There's not a single government promise I can think of in 50 years that I've been connected to this river work that's ever been kept. And citizens' activism on the Patuxent is literally the only thing I'm aware of that has produced water quality gains over the years. That's why this river has its own river commission, the only one in the state of Maryland, because people got good and mad and channeled that anger into constructive action. So I do believe that's an important but very separate component from the Bay movement, from governmental action, from corporate funded environmentalism. It's its own thing.
Is there a way to link that to those other things? Or you think they should be kept separate?
I don't know that there's a way to link them, right? Let me put it another way. The community of people who want to be funded by the worst polluters in the Bay has nothing to do with the people who want to get reparations and get those guys to pay their fair share. Those are totally irreconcilable different movements. I don't think people see that because they assume that since everybody, quote, wants the same thing, that we're all on the same page. We're not, actually, and we're not winning. These are resources in serious trouble. I mean, you can talk to people and you get the half full, half empty paradox. In my book, there's a half empty movement in that virtually everything being done to save it can be defunded tomorrow. right? The work we're doing isn't funded by anybody, unfortunately, or for whatever it's worth. But that means that it's work driven by something other than fundraising, which means it has a very different gravity well, a very different range of toolboxes it can use, actually.
That's very helpful. All right. Fred, anything before we move on to Carl?
No, I appreciate the time to really explain it, because I know that sometimes people misunderstand it. I know it's been confused with anti-science sometimes. To be honest, it's not. But I do know that sometimes the only thing that scientists are interested in these communities is the science, and that meets a lot of pushback. Not interested in the culture, the history, the folklore, the institutional memory. It's not science denying. It puts science in a hierarchy where it's one of many things the community looks at in order to achieve its self-determinism. So I wanted to clear the air on that, because I know I make people mad occasionally by taking pot shots at scientists who come to a community and don't look at anything but the science. So I did want to get that off my chest.
Well, it's a really interesting thing to say. And I think the point about the fact that maybe the assumption that we all want the same thing isn't necessarily true.
We want it our way. We don't all want the same thing in exactly the same way.
Right. Well, thanks, Fred.
Thank you.
Carl.
Yes. So there's already a lot to respond to, but let me first give you the background on my engagement in the Bay and the surrounding environments. I began working in the Bay back when I was a college student. My parents moved to Annapolis, and I spent summers working in the EPA lab in Annapolis, which at that time was running a field program on the Potomac River. And I spent 2 years, summers for 2 years, working with water samples that have been collected by field crews just off of the Blue Plains sewage treatment plant in the Potomac. And this was sort of my first experience in this kind of environment. And I was literally stunned at the quality or lack of quality, if you will, of the little water samples that came back to us to run nutrient and DO samples on. They look like pea soup. They had things floating in them that unfortunately I could recognize. I do remember that one of the first things they did for us when we were starting that work was take us down to the Naval Academy dispensary and get us inoculated for all kinds of strange things that I never really imagined were going to be a threat to me. So my beginning introduction to the Bay was at its worst, if you will. And that led me to want to better understand the system. As a result, I spent much of my career looking at what could be done and how we could go about doing the things that would make it better. And one of the long lessons at the end, to jump to the end of the career, is that I have learned, and a lot of my colleagues have demonstrated, that in fact, we can make a difference. We have made significant improvements through the combination of scientific understanding and political and public will to things like the Potomac River. The water quality in the environment below, in the upper reaches of the Potomac River, is orders of magnitude better than it was back when I first encountered that system. So the fact is, we can improve things, we can mitigate our consequences, but as Fred has alluded to, the challenges that we have dealt with consistently are the need to get multiple entities engaged in that effort. And the thing that has evolved, I guess, in the time that I've been working on those things is an understanding that, damn it, the system's changing. At the same time, we're trying to restore it or fix it. And so the challenges that we are confronting and continue to confront are not necessarily the same ones that we started with. There is a need for a constant evolution in not just our understanding of the system, but the approaches we're going to take to try and bring it to a condition that we all desire. And from from my perspective as one of the science community's members working on that, the real challenge to me was always, how do you articulate that need for constant evolution, for a willingness to change or reimagine your goals? How do you articulate that in a way that people, one, understand it and don't dismiss you as someone who's just chasing the latest and greatest new idea? How do you get people to take that and use it to motivate their interest, their activism, their funding, whatever it's combination of things it's going to take. So I found that a large part of my career was in part unlearning. Unlearning is a wrong term, but learning how to suppress all the things that were impressed on us as practicing scientists. The need to caveat, the need to be considerate of all the things that really sort of condition the answers that you're giving, and how to focus or try to learn to be a clear, concise, and what's the term I want to use? It's not motivational, it's convincing advisor for people. And that meant not saying a lot of things that you really would like to say in the breadth, with the breadth of your understanding, but things which you know would ultimately just sort of cloud the issues and prevent people from coming to a concise action item. So learning to communicate has been probably the biggest element in my long career. Something that obviously I still am working on, hence the fact that words don't come tripping off my tongue now like they do at other times. But that understanding that the system can be improved and that people all need to be working together to do it, that we need to continually evolve our understanding and our approach, are the kinds of key understandings that I think need to be relayed to whoever follows us, whoever is picking up the work in these areas. And so there are many other apocryphal stories that could be told about things I have tried to do, failed at miserably, but let me just stop there and see what's in the back of your mind that you would like to redirect me to.
Well, I think it's interesting that you talked about the lesson of, well, your continuing development of the ability to communicate, and I'm putting that together with Fred's comment about science as a piece of or as one of the many things that goes together with culture and history in leading a community to self-determinism, right? And so I'm kind of wondering about how you use communication for science to take its rightful place in that group of things that a community is putting together to plot its path forward. And Fred, I'm kind of watching you. Am I getting that kind of right? And so, it's not all science, Carl, right? So we are trying to craft the important things in that message so that they can kind of take their rightful place in the whole balance of things that a community is considering, right?
Right. So again, one of the early understandings that I had and most people in the science community had when we began looking at the problems of estuaries and coastal management and the water quality issues that were there was that we are all individually part of the problem, and that while there were some, we could go out and fix a sewage treatment plant and that would clear up some, but ultimately we had to get to all the people who live in the watershed and let them each understand what their investment is in improving conditions and what they can do. And that has been the major challenge. And as Fred has pointed out, one of the first things that you learn when you try to begin working at local and individual scales is that the environment isn't number one on everybody's list of things to be worried about. It shows up for whatever reason, and those of us who have done lots of survey work are always sort of bemused by the fact that environment and environmental conditions show up as high priorities on almost all questionnaires, so where you solicit people's input. But the reality is that when push comes to shove or you need them to take action, it clearly becomes a lesser motivator for what actually ensues. And so figuring out how, one, to listen to those people, to understand what their interests are, and curiously, Fred was talking about separating what's meaningful and important from what's not, learning to hear people and figure out which ones were actually telling you something you could act on and which ones were never going to hear what you said back to them is a painful lesson. I can't tell you how many times talking about climate change, I ran into the anti-Agenda 21 crowd, and learning what to anticipate and what to expect from them, and therefore what not to respond to, became as much a part of delivering an effective message as crafting the points that I wanted to make for them.
Interesting. Fred, do you have a question that you'd like to ask Carl?
Not especially. I just simply observe that you're right. We do all have a piece of it. I just don't think the corporate burden, if we're talking about coal burning power plants and CAFOs on the Eastern Shore, they have a very different burden, that it's not all the same burden. But you're right, we all do have a piece of it. I think some have more of a piece than others, and those are the ones we focus on. We're not looking for the guys throwing beer cans in the watershed. We're looking for the wholesale polluters, definitely.
Yeah, well, the challenge is not just to pick out the people who are to blame and point the finger at them. The challenge is to motivate the rest of the community to understand those issues and then work with their, particularly the politicians who ultimately end up providing the regulation and some of the public funding that is key to this. One of the lessons that we all tried not to say publicly for years was that, bottom line, voluntary fixes don't solve the problem nearly as effectively as we need them to. And so, bottom line, it's public policy and regulation. And to get those sort of actions taken, it's more than the scientists whispering into the senator's ear. It's the senator's constituents who need to articulate their interests, their desires. And so we do need to find ways for science and the activist community to work together, and hopefully not drop the mess in Karen's lap, which we typically do.
And with that, Karen.
Wow, where do I start? Well, there's a couple things that I wanted to say right before I started on my own journey to where I am. And I think that one of them has to do with the statement that Denise and Fred were saying is maybe we don't all want the same thing. Maybe we came into it thinking that everybody wants the same thing, and maybe we don't. And I just recall the question very early on in COVID, there was the statement very early on with the COVID pandemic is we're all in the same boat. And the correction I heard was, no, we're not all in the same boat. We're on the same rocky water, and we're all in different types of boats, or maybe not a boat at all. And so understanding that everybody's coming from it in a different place is really important. And it's important to what I do. And I think that the real challenge for all of us, and not just me as manager, is that, the phrase of one of the scenarios that was run for nutrient reduction is everybody has to do everything everywhere. And that to me is a real challenge, particularly as Fred points out, different communities want different things, have different motivations, have to be worked with in a different way. And how we do that is a real challenge to the management of what we're trying to achieve overall with the Chesapeake Bay program, and not just with water quality, but across the fisheries management and habitat and everything that we're trying to do to achieve a balanced ecosystem that is vital to the community, vital to the economy, and is sustainable as we move into the future. That's a huge effort on a massive scale that keeps us all up at night, I think. So with that, so one of the things that I wanted to start out with is that I also had started out very early in the Chesapeake Bay. I was really raised here. I moved here when I was 2. I lived on the water. I'm privileged to have done that. But I lived on the water on Weems Creek, which is a creek of the Severn River, which runs into the bay. And in the 60s, one of the things that was really notable is that this was a time when we were doing pretty radical things to the environment, but the environment hadn't been necessarily as impacted, or we didn't notice the impact of the environment as much. We had big crabs on our pilings. We could swim, we could fish, we could sail. We had so much bay grasses in our creek that we had weed witches coming through and cutting them down so that you could make way for your various boats and props and whatnot. And we called it seaweed. And the difference between what we're calling them now, bay grasses, and seaweed, you can just hear the difference in the way we're doing things. Also in the 60s, I mean, we used to get on our bikes and ride around behind the mosquito truck that was spewing out, I don't know what, with the mosquitoes, and I still don't know what the ramifications of that are going to be as I get older. So in the 60s, we didn't realize, I don't believe we realized that there was much of a problem. And it wasn't until 72 with the Tropical Storm Agnes. And to me, Agnes had a different impact on me than later on, how I realized how it impacted the Chesapeake Bay, because this is a storm that was very unique and unusual. It went up the bay, up the Susquehanna, and into the Finger Lakes. And to me, it wasn't so much that it impacted the bay as much as it impacted my life. It was in June. I couldn't go swimming. I couldn't go to my grandfather's house on Cayuga Lake because I had to go along the floodplain of the Susquehanna River on Route 15. So it impacted me. It wasn't until I was in college and read, Silent Spring and other books that I recognized what we were doing to the environment and the impacts that it had. And it wasn't until I started working at the Chesapeake Bay program that I realized the impact of Agnes on the Chesapeake Bay and how that was a turning point for the study of the Chesapeake Bay and where we are today with the Chesapeake Bay program. I've been in this program since 1991. So I've been here for a long time and seen a lot of changes and had a lot of pivots myself. I came on board as the Living Resources Subcommittee Coordinator. And really my background was a bachelor's in biology and a master's in environmental management, but all of it had to do with my focus. My focus ended up being more on wetlands. And part of that is really impactful in terms of where I ended up today, because I was not solidly in the science of wetlands and I was not solidly in the policy or management of wetlands. I was kind of in both worlds. I had a job that did a lot of research in wetlands and soils and the nutrients, the way wetlands filtered nutrients, both for my master's degree, as well as I worked at CERC, at Smithsonian Environmental Research Center. But I also did a master's project that looked at the impacts of the Clean Water Act Section 404 on wetland, on losing our wetlands and in North and South Carolina. So I was intrigued by both worlds, and to me, the connections are what intrigues me most. So I'm never fully in the space of science or fully in the space of management or policy. I like to be in that continuum between them. And so I think that one of the things that I really, that changed me from being in a science and research was that need to be a connector. And a connector means that you not only understand the science, but that you can communicate it. The Chesapeake Bay program, to me, we talk about the TMDL and how the TMDL, the total maximum daily load, was really necessary because I often hear it's because the voluntary effort failed. I totally disagree with that. I really think that what the agreement that the governors and the administrator put in starting in 1983 did a lot to get us to where we were able to do the type of cleanup that we're doing now through the TMDL and the watershed implementation plans. They built relationships and trust among the various partners of the states and EPA, because we had many commitments that we worked together on for several years. And they built, and Carl was talking about being adaptive management and how we have to learn as we move forward. And I think that while we weren't doing strict adaptive management, we were doing a lot of learning through time, not only on our relationships and what we could do together, not only on the science and our understanding of the science and how we use the science, but also on how we managed the science. So we did tributary strategies. These were precursors to the watershed implementation plans. And we learned a lot, and we did reduce nutrients and sediment as we went forward. So I learned a lot. I'm skipping around a little bit, but I was the Living Resources Subcommittee Coordinator for a few years. I came in understanding wetlands. I learned that bay grasses, that it was bay grasses and not seaweed, and that bay grasses were good and not bad. I learned what fish passage was and how to pronounce it. I learned what fisheries management plans were and what mortality rates were. But in addition to that, I learned about how to make commitments that stuck. And what I mean with that is that as we learned through the agreements, those things that we could set a metric on, those things that we can measure, we did. And so the first one was in 1987. We didn't get to 40% nutrient reduction, but we focused on that. And in Chesapeake 2000, we had several more that we focused on because we had outcomes that had deliverables. Basically, we could measure toward them. I also learned that if you do that too often and without too much thinking, that might not be a good idea either, because then you have things that you are accountable to the public on that you don't have a path forward to achieve. So I did learn that, and honestly, that's a big learning moment for me as well. I think that moving forward in this adaptive mode, I do believe Fred is absolutely right that we have to understand how to work with communities who have different interests and who have different motivations better than what we have done in the past. I think that the relationship building that we've done at the federal and state level needs to drop down more into the community level. And I think that what got us here won't get us there. And I'm sorry I was a little rambly, but those are my thoughts, and this is where I am.
Oh, Karen, that was really interesting. I've never heard the arc of your experience, and I'm kind of remembering something that has recently been in my mind, and it's a definition of justice. So bear with me for a little while, but that justice has elements of accountability and restoration, that it's not just all accountability, right? So accountability does not justice make. There has to be a reparation or a restoration, right? And so Dave Jasinski asked, in terms of Chesapeake restoration, what does success look like to you? And I would broaden that in terms of justice. What does success look like to you going forward? And I'll ask you to begin, and then I'm going to ask Carl and Fred to respond as well.
I think that's an excellent question, because I do think that, I do think that there's a huge difference between equality and equitability, and being equal and being equitable are two different things. And I think that what justice looks like to me in the Chesapeake Bay restoration protection effort has to do with making sure that we are equitable in our responses and in the way we move forward with things. I don't know exactly what that means, but it just means that we're not doing the same thing everywhere with everyone. That we have to be equitable, but not necessarily equal. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Sure.
Let me
Fred or
respond
Carl?
let me respond because I'll probably light Fred's fuse. But you know, I come at that question from the perspective of, you know, the ethic of Earth Day, I guess, from way back when. And so when I look at justice in the terms, at least in my concept of what we're talking about, I see that as way less important in trying to define what success in managing the Bay would be. My concept of success is that we manage to preserve and/or enhance the capacity of the system to provide benefits for future generations. And getting there is you know, something that requires constant revision, rethinking, and attention to our learning. The questions of justice, at least the way I conceive of them being framed now, are short-term issues and don't necessarily comport with that essential long-term vision. So it's not that I'm against equitability or any of that, but if I'm going to define success, I'm going to define it in a long-term perspective, not shorter term.
Mm-hmm.
I had a friendly argument with a lawyer friend of mine recently, and it ended with him making the following statement. We were talking about pollution trading, by the way, and he said, "Who cares if it's unjust, if it'll save the Bay?" I can't sell that in any Black and brown community. If that is the underlying ethic of anybody's movement, I realize he was speaking for himself. And that's kind of my point. I do think that that question that you've asked has an individual answer that's going to be a little bit different for everyone, but it's important to be a visionary answer. When I talk to people around the country about these diversity and inclusion initiatives, I often talk to the chairmen of various boards and I ask them what their visionary sense is if we actually achieve the ends that we're shooting for, particularly with inclusion and diversity. The worst answer I got was from the chairman of a group, a national environmental group, a big green. And he said, "I don't know, Fred, but funders like that." And I know I can't sell that in the Black and brown community either. These movements really do have to rethink whom they speak for, because there are plenty of other voices out there. If these are everyman movements, then they need to reflect that in their membership and in their governance and in their values. If they're not, I don't have a problem with that, but I would have a much more moderate view of whom they're really speaking for. If it's just a bunch of white folks who had a club and had access to money and they're doing great work, but only in the communities they know. You see where I'm going? And I don't see these as inherently race-based issues, but I do think the communication arc is different depending on whom you're talking to and what their knowledge base and experience is. And I don't know that these movements have that perspective. I think they assume that everybody's the same.
Yeah.
What would success look like, Fred? If from your perspective in the work that you do, what would success look like? Or what is that visionary?
There's several things. One, success at this juncture in my life looks like a new riverkeeper with a set of values that will carry the work forward. Maybe not the same way I would, but the idea of a freestanding, independently voiced conservation movement run by citizens is a vision. And it's a vision to, as a successor, essentially, to those of you who know the Bernie Fowler movement. You know, Bernie Fowler, Senator Fowler, well-known activist on my river, 96, 97, something like that these days. We're very much in touch with him. But there needs to be a successor movement. Even Bernie understands that. And I believe that this whole idea of planting seeds and keeping pilot lights on, to me, success looks like an interconnected network of people on this river who are free voices, who can hold feet to fire, who are not constrained by either funding restrictions or authoritarian sources over their heads. Because again, history has shown us, at least on the Patuxent, citizen movements can be very, very, very effective. And I think that's what sometimes the Bay movement has kind of missed the boat on. I think there's a lot of knowledge and, you know, folklore and perspective. These are rich stories, and these narratives compel people. They're exciting narratives. They're the ones that get people up out of their chairs and want to do stuff, more stuff than you can pay them for, more stuff than you can fundraise for, in my view.
So Fred, can I respond to that? Because I really, it's interesting that you can save the Bay, you can clean up the Bay and forget about justice. And that's the only focus that you have. But I think that the Chesapeake Bay program has tried in its vision of in the Chesapeake Bay Agreement. There's a fast way of doing things, and then there's a way of doing things that is more sustainable as you move into the future. And that more sustainable includes exactly what you're saying in terms of people, it becoming part of what people do, what people want to do, what people are excited about doing. And that's part of the sustainability, as much as making sure you have sustainable crab populations and, you know, making sure you have sustainable water quality and that sort of thing. If you don't have those things in a sustainable way, we can't move. We don't have a future where we're not constantly fighting against the effort rather than moving forward with it.
Well, so here's an odd question. Who owns, I'm asking it very deliberately, who owns the blueprint for the Bay? Because mind you, I think anybody who didn't participate in shaping it doesn't have a sense of ownership or investment in it. They don't care about it because it's not theirs. So who owns the blueprint for the Bay? In your eyes, in your vision? I'm just curious. Whose plan is that?
Well, I can tell you, in my opinion, it's not so much who owns it, but I would say who has made that commitment. The Chesapeake Bay 2014 watershed plan is 9 signatories. It's the governors of the 6 states. It's the mayor of DC. It's EPA administrator on behalf of the government, and it's the Chesapeake Bay Commission. Those are the ones who have committed to these goals and outcomes. But I don't think that they could begin to be successful without being more inclusive with our partnership. We have 800 people plus on various organizational units in our program, and they come from more than just the federal and state. So I don't have a single straightforward answer of this person or this organization owns it, but I do feel that the 9 signatories of the agreement are the ones that are accountable to that agreement.
Yeah, and the point I was really trying to make is that the people who are most invested in it, the people closest to that, are the people who probably have the most confidence that that's a way forward. Others may not have the same sense of investment in it. And I think it needs that, if indeed that's the plan we've settled on that we're all pursuing. I think there's a lot of slippage surrounding exactly whose plan and whether that's a plausible plan. I mean, frankly.
Right. And I think this might be a good, Bill Dennison has a question, and it is, I think it segues into this. In terms of that blueprint, what can we do to entrain more people and more diverse people into the restoration effort?
And that was the kind of point I was trying to angle towards. In order for people to be invested in it, they have to have some sense of participation in it. They had nothing to do with it. It came from up on high. It came from wherever it came from. And I realize that's hazardous because it means you open it up to a lot of input from folks who may or may not be scientists, who may or may not have a perspective that you can appreciate. But nonetheless, people would own it if they had some participation in it. And I'm saying that's one of the problems here. If we're talking Black and brown communities, of which I don't speak for any of those communities, I know it's a thin hope that I can go to them and say, you know, somebody's come up with a plan. If we follow this, it's the solution to your problems. Good luck with that. It's a different problem. It's the Bay problem, which may or may not be shared by communities that are not proximate to the Chesapeake Bay. I'm not challenging the plan. I'm simply challenging the communications outreach required to get buy-in. Is a little different than simply coming up with a plan and putting it on the web or having a meeting and having PowerPoints. At the end of the day, we just have to stop polluting these rivers, right? I mean, how many scientists does it take to figure out how to clean the Bay up? How many, you need a room full of scientists to figure out, I've seen a million PowerPoints. They all say that. Stop polluting, cut back on the pollution going into it.
Well, Fred, your comment reminds me, there's an old Henry Kissinger quote that I love, which says, any policy, you know, born in the minds of a few and in the hearts of none has little chance of success, right? And so it's about, it may not be, what do I say, realistic to think that it'll be born in the minds of everyone, but it does need to be in the hearts of quite a few people. And I think it's that translation that we talk about.
Agree. If it's not, then it's a MacGuffin. And I think sometimes that's what Save the Bay is. It's a MacGuffin. It drives the conversation. It means whatever it means in the listener's head. It means different things to different people, I guess is what I'm saying.
Carl?
So, you know, I listened to this, and this is like so many discussions that we have around these subjects, and they all drive me vaguely nuts, because in a sense, they argue that absent a democratic sort of approach to a plan to fix the Bay, we can't go forward. We will not succeed because not everybody's bought into it. And what always occurs to me is, if you know enough about a system, and you know what the trajectory is, and you know what needs to be done in order to avoid a dismal outcome, but you don't have a majority of people bought in, does that mean you can't step on the brake? You can't make changes? You can't move forward with a plan? You know, that seems to me a prescription for inevitable disaster, the tragedy of the commons, you know, writ large.
Yeah, I would argue in reverse that it's also imperialism if we expect to follow the plan handed down to us by people where we don't have any say over its outcome whatsoever. It means that we're in the compliance mode, but we're not really invested in these movements because we got to do as people say. That's what I hear. I'm saying it's a little more complicated than that in indigenous communities and lots of communities.
And I'm saying exactly the same thing, that it's a lot more complicated than you make it.
Sure.
This sort of set of choices, you either have us bought in or you don't, and therefore you're not worth doing. That's just not how the system operates.
Probably, but I'm comparing it to other movements, other justice movements, women's rights, human rights, and so on, which, granted, there's a lot of slippage in those movements too. But quite frankly, the grassroots sides of those movements operate fairly independently and cooperatively towards a common aim, even though there might be nuances. So I'm not convinced that we can't have that conversation because it'll take too long and we'll lose the Bay in the meantime. I actually think these are richer conversations that do produce new and better ideas sometimes. I think the Bay movement is starved for some fresh darned ideas. After 50 years and a C- Bay, God knows we got to have some better ideas out there. You know, keep doing this stuff. I don't see it foreseeably that we're going to have a much better off Bay if we just keep piling on what we've been doing all along. So I'd like to think.
One of the things that I think that the watershed, the agreements do, and there's one more recently than others, is that it puts out a goal to get to, acres or pounds, or but it doesn't necessarily prescribe how to get there. And I think that opens it up for a dialogue that can happen in terms of how best to get it there. We do management strategies that can be updated fairly frequently and fairly flexibly on how to get there. So I think that the way, particularly the 2014 agreement was written, was intentional to say, we want to get this much done by a date certain, but we're going to push down how to do that to other voices. And so it opens up the opportunity. I'm not saying that we're perfect and that we've been perfectly open with all of our communities, but what I'm saying is that I think that there is an opportunity with the way the agreements have been developed to ensure that there can be multiple voices and multiple ways of moving forward on those voices in order to meet those outcomes.
I can concede that, but my experience has been that we can leverage a lot of success by dissenting, by fighting these existing systems, and we don't make much progress unless the work itself is transformative of the bad system. And that's the hardest work to do, quite frankly, because people think you're, wobbly, you're throwing bombs, you're picking on these systems. The truth is the systems are screwy. They're really broken. They're not likely to lead citizens towards a clean water result, right? So there's a lot of work to be done there, and I don't disagree with you. The ground truth thing I think is important, particularly, like I said, when I'm dealing with Black and brown communities who want more beef. They know a rain barrel is not a solution to any problem they're working on. They know darn well there's a lot more to it, and it's politics and a lot of other stuff that we don't talk about in the science realm. So these are problems. We hand these communities to comply with these federal mandates. And you're right, we don't really tell them how to do it. We don't figure it out for them, right? They have to struggle to find a way to fund all this new infrastructure and struggle. I get it. I get all of that. So I'm not disagreeing with you. I think what we probably don't see eye to eye on is we see different things from different places in the continuum, right? Carl, because he's a scientist, Karen, because you're an administrator of an environmental program, and I'm an activist. I'm no bones about it. I'm not really a river keeper. I'm an activist. I'm a guy that fights the system because the system needs to be fought.
And that's why you're the perfect people to have this conversation. I'm going to pivot a little bit because I think it is associated with it. There's a question about as science and management has evolved, so has technology. How do you all see technology continuing to support the restoration and community inclusion efforts? And that question might be a little nuanced to say, how can we use it in a transformative way? Okay, so is there technology that, and Fred, you might be able to answer this. I mean, with your background, certainly in media, and there's now social platforms. I mean, is there a way for technology for us to be transformative to these systems that aren't working?
I'm a little undecided. I do believe that technology for people who are really on the science train holds out hope that we can find a clever way to let people keep on polluting and deal with the pollution anyhow. I think sometimes people are on that page. Can't we find a clever way to get around those pollution limits? I don't think there's any way to get around reducing the loads on these rivers. That's what's frustrating to me is people keep trying to forestall and put off and kick the can down the road for ratcheting down the pollution loads, hoping they can find a technological solution or they can trade it or mitigate it or something. And I think I'm a fundamentalist. Just stop polluting these waters or slow it down or hold it back or enforce or regulate. I believe the big lie behind these programs is that you can keep adding new permits and new burdens to these waterways and still somehow achieve those limits. We have a total maximum daily load spectrum type of program. Maximum itself is a problem, right? Shouldn't we really be doing minimum loads? I mean, so the whole regulatory scheme is kind of calibrated to keep ratcheting up the loads. We haven't really attacked that problem. We're looking for the science to solve it for us, or the oysters, the filter feeders.
Carl?
Well, yeah. Well, in ways, technology is finding solutions to loads, to allow lifestyles to persist the way they seem while still effectively minimizing what comes into our waters. But the reality is, and what we've understood for a while, that is only ever going to get us those sort of point source controls are only ever going to get us part of the way there. And so it's the non-point source stuff, the things that we all do individually, the things that the individual farmers are doing or people do in their backyards. That's what's going to continue to create the problem. And the challenge is, how do you convince people that their ownership of such a small, tiny, little piece of the problem is one that bears their attention? And I think that's the challenge that, or the failure of the technology we currently have, which is it can be so precise as to tell you that your failure to sweep your street on every day of the week is going to make no detectable difference in the water quality in the bay. or your tributary. I mean, you know, we can see just how minorly impactful individual actions are. And so how do we get that message across that, yes, individually you don't mean a thing, but collectively you are the problem?
Mm-hmm.
That's one I don't understand. Well, I understand
Karen,
how to solve it.
Karen, did you want to respond or?
I think that there's a place for technology. I agree with Fred that the technology is not going to solve our problem, but there's a place for technology. And I would say things like the wastewater treatment plants, the point sources, nitrogen removal was a big innovative technology that is now pretty normalized across the watershed, but it's reduced nitrogen in wastewater treatment. It's also helpful in things like monitoring. So improving our ability to monitor through satellite imagery or through, you know, now we can get down to the 1 meter contour, and that helps us with our management. So there's a place for technology. Is it going to save the day? No. Is it going to make us more efficient? Maybe. Is it going to have some real life-changing things? Maybe. I mean, I don't know. It's sort of like saying what the microwave will do for us before the microwave existed, right? You didn't really know that you needed it, and now you use it every day.
So there's an interesting from Jeff Corbin. To Fred's point that what we need to do is stop polluting the bay. In my opinion, most regulated sources of pollution have been squeezed about as hard as they can be squeezed. So the we in the pollution sense is truly you and I, meaning each of us that live, drive, recreate, farm, etc. in the bay shed. We all need to lower our individual impacts. Here's the truth telling. Do panelists feel that getting people, not a few, but the majority, to change their actions in their everyday lives is a realistic goal?
Can't say I understand that question exactly.
Well,
maybe someone else can take a whack at it.
I think the answer is yes. It's a realistic goal in the sense that it has been demonstrated in small populations. It has been demonstrated in select groups. The challenge for us is how to extend those experiences to a significant enough size of the population to make a real difference. You know, how do we get everybody to get their vaccination? And, you know, so that we achieve herd immunity. You know, on the same thing in the Bay. I mean, we have demonstrated that, this is one that always gets me. We've demonstrated that if you provide the right incentives to a collective of farmers, they'll actually report on each other. They will build enough peer pressure to improve their collective behavior. And so how do we take that experience and, you know, translate it to city dwellers, to, you know, people in other types of communities? I don't have the answer to that.
Right, and that's that behavior change paradigm that guides much of the Bay movement, which I have also objected to because I think social change is a better frame, at least in Black and brown communities. Behavior change only gets you halfway there. Social change gets you all the way. Let me just say, all of this is Zen. From where I sit, 17 years of listening to people's Patuxent stories, those stories are now a part of me. I do, on certain days, have a sense of hopelessness that we'll ever save much on this planet. I mean, just the background radiation in the oceans alone is enough to make me depressed on certain days. So I do believe these are moral and ethical challenges that we must attack, and that we in some way are cleansing because we're fighting the right fights and we're struggling in order to redeem these resources. It says something about who we are as human beings, and it's a leap of faith. Okay, I'm not going to put it all on the basis of faith because that's kind of like rolling the dice and maybe we'll clean these watersheds up. But I'm putting my faith in people's essential wisdom, people's passion for these waterways, the integral sense that they're connected to them in ways that they can't change. And so they must labor to save them. And that's the part I can't quantify. I can't put that on a science lecture, but I do believe that's what gives us the wind at our backs to get up every day and go to court and fight these fights against significant odds, because judges don't love us. You know what I'm saying? They think we inconvenience these rich guys who bring lots of jobs and pay lots of taxes. Sometimes all we've got is our spines. And that's important. That says something about who we are. That's magnetic. Those kinds of causes are magnetic.
Is that, Fred, part of the pilot light?
Yeah, that's a part of the pilot light. And to be fair, and let me credit where that came from. Gary Hodge, who was the note taker at the Patuxent Charrettes in the 1980s, said that that was the goal that Bernie Fowler had. Light the pilot light. He had a political constituency and was able to leverage it. But the deal is keep that pilot light on because we're not going to fix this in our lifetimes. Hence, we need a new Patuxent Riverkeeper in the foreseeable future. This one's getting old and worn out and burned out, right? And we need a connected base of these movements up and down the watershed to keep boot to behind on these resources. Get these laws actually enforced. We pass them and then we put them on the shelf. That takes citizen heat. There's no substitute for it.
So Karen, I already know that you stay up at night or things keep you up at night. Is the expectation that we can engage enough people one of them?
Well, it is, but you know, I think enough people is the right word. So can we engage everyone? No, I think that there's always going to be that section of people that are not even, sometimes not even in their best interests. They're not going to do what it is that everybody else is doing. But I do think that we can collectively, as long as you find that interest, that value within the individual or the social movement, as Fred's suggesting, that aligns with what it is that you're asking them to do. Because I think that we tend to work in our own self-interests. And so we have to find that practice, that thing, that what we do is ultimately in my best interest. And sometimes that means redefining what my best interest is. And you know, we have gotten, we were talking just now about technology. We have gotten a world that's full of technology and ways that we're living that may not be sustainable. Is it in my best interest to want more? Sure. But if I redefine what more means and say that more to me means more sustainable farming, fishing, habitat, a more livable community, if I redefine it for myself in a way that is truly now my self-interest, then yeah, I believe that we can get people to change what they're doing and how they're doing it. But I'm, you know, cockeyed optimist, so.
I want everyone on the webinar to just remind you that we have until 1:30 reserved today. If you have other commitments, or you are free to leave, but we are going to keep the discussion open until 1:30 in light of sort of the uniqueness of the format. So feel free to enter a question because we do have some time. Let me ask you all the next one, because I think that this is, we hinted around at this, but I don't think we really did it in a specific way. I think, and Fred, you've alluded to the next river keeper, and Carl is trying to retire, and Karen, I hope you're here for a while, but I'm not going to ask. But you've all had a wealth of experience, right? And so as you are getting ready for a changing of the guard, what advice do you personally have for the next generation of leaders? And you can talk about leaders in what dimension. If you want to, you can be that specific, but what advice would you have for the next generation? What are you going to tell the next scientist, you know, the next branch chief, Karen, the next riverkeeper, Fred?
You know, I would borrow from my friend Bernie Fowler, who sadly, well, maybe not sadly, because it's a generational thing. He likes to quote Winston Churchill, which doesn't fly so well with this generation, actually. In fact, my students at St. Mary's, occasionally I talk about the Lone Ranger and they don't know who he is either. So I don't know who the best icon is, but I'll say that Bernie likes to quote Winston Churchill at the darkest hour. Never, 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 never give up. I would also say you have to like people, because the way you clean this watershed up is you have to interact with the people in it. And you have to have infinite patience with people and their stuff. I'm probably the only guy in the Patuxent watershed that most of the watershed has my cell phone number. And I've had to draw boundaries because they call you all day and night, because there's a lot going on in this watershed that people want help for. People are desperate for help on how to fight their own battles. Everyone's fighting for something that's important to them. And we can accommodate that, but it's a lot of voltage to put through one organization, you know, and one person designated as the quote river keeper. So I would I've been called out by my students over the years for having the financial freedom to do this. I had 2 careers before I came to riverkeeping. If someone took this job on and had student loans and other stuff, other obligated, I'm not so sure. So I'm working very hard to try and make this organization a little more habitable for people with traditional skills, because I came to it with this kind of, freelance stringer, news media kind of ethic, which is a little, I won't say devil may care, but it's a little loosey-goosey. And I think this organization, to thrive and survive over the long haul, is going to have to get a little better at, the sharper pencil, sharper pencil in terms of what we can really leverage in this watershed.
Carl or Karen?
So for the students that I've had, I guess the two lessons, the 2 sort of take-home lessons were, one, question everything, and don't ever assume that you're the right answer. So, no matter who's speaking and no matter what you've heard about them, doesn't mean that what comes out of their mouth is going to be gospel and should be treated as such. That's critical to being an engaged scientist. And the other is sort of the same message that Fred is relaying and crediting Winston Churchill through Bernie Fowler, which is, this is an activity. Environmental management and trying to improve systems or manage systems is something you can never ever walk away from. You've got to stay engaged, no matter how painful. And so, you need to learn to identify the people who will hear you and make sure that you are supporting them if they happen to be in a position to make change. This is particularly true in identifying politicians who are open to these things and have the power to make some of these things public policy. Those people, it doesn't matter what party they're in, sometimes it doesn't matter what other interests they have, but if you can find them and they're listening, you need to work with them constantly. Just take advantage of every tool that's you have access to.
And I guess I would add, for me, it's listen, learn, find people and surround yourself with people who think outside of the box. Don't be afraid of change. Really get good at change management, because it's always about change. And be as adaptable and flexible as you can. Honestly, I think that the skills that are needed in environmental management are much more the critical thinking type skills. They're the well, not just critical thinking, but also relationship building. Honestly, if you can't build relationships, if you can't have critical thinking, and if you can't surround yourself with smarter people than you are, then you're not going to be able to move forward.
Well said. Here is a very interesting question from Fred Dobbs. What is the intersectionality of the issues we've been talking about with the issue of population growth in the Bay watershed?
Oh, well, that's a huge one. We've got approaching 1 million folks in a Patuxent, 110 linear miles, 36 wastewater treatment plants. There's obviously a nexus between the decline of this waterway and cramming as many people in it as the real estate people can sell houses to. As a guy legally trained, I still struggle with how to regulate that, because the entire judicial system is designed around private property and the Fifth Amendment. And, the culture of Maryland is tied up in this whole land use as local thing, which means we do it very badly for the most part. There's no real continuity on how people are doing it in one county over the next. That's a good darn question, but yes, there's a carrying capacity. We know this. And we also know that if we pay more than a certain percentile of these watersheds, they go downhill pretty fast too. And I don't know how to get a handle on that. I don't know what strategy I could use to regulate growth, but we're under some pressure from the brain trust of people who advise us, like, that's the 800-pound gorilla. What do we do about growth? And when I fly this watershed, let me just add, and I do a couple of times a year just to see stuff from the air that I can't see from the ground, you can see that we're not using the land efficiently. You can see that we're putting houses where the best views are, where the most sensitive lands are. You look in the interior away from the waterways and you see all these empty, blank areas that we might have been availing ourselves of. So there is an economic dynamic that goes into where we put houses. And I know we're building houses at something like 30% in Maryland, 30% beyond the demand. So it's a shell game around real estate for the most part. We're not doing much redevelopment at all, because frankly, you can't sell $1 million homes, I think, in redeveloped areas. And so again, the economic incentives aren't really there. There's a lot to unpack for a state that had at one time prided itself on smart growth. You know, the Maryland Department of Planning head at one, I won't say which administration, said to me that we do smart growth because we're all really smart people. It didn't leave me with a lot of sense of confidence, to be honest.
Is there an entrance ramp to that conversation at the community scale, Fred?
It's a tough one because it actually blunders into Catholicism and population control. I mean, it's a tough conversation to keep on track without people getting good and mad, to be honest. I mean, I'm just laying it out there. It's a necessary conversation, but not an easy one to have.
Karen or Carl?
I was going to say it's a tough conversation to have with politicians because it all comes down to available public revenues, and you know, growth is what fuels the public wheel at this point.
And the lie of infinite growth being possible. It's a lie.
Absolutely. I always thought it'd be kind of fun if you got a charge card for a certain amount of pollution when you're born, and you know, you can use it, and when you're out, well, maybe we need that for the Chesapeake Bay so we can just ship everybody to other parts of the country when they expended their available pollutant load.
I knew a good idea was going to come out of this webinar.
Well, I don't know. It's a really tough issue. It's a really tough issue, and it's one of individual impact as well as collective impact. And I'm trying to get a handle on that. I spent a lot of years in the Chesapeake Bay program with a subcommittee called Land Growth and Stewardship Subcommittee that really was trying to focus on that very issue. And I have to say that was a very difficult subcommittee to get traction in for a lot of different reasons. The states are very different in terms of how they manage growth, and it's a very local level situation, and people are coming into the watershed at higher and higher rates. And so I don't have an answer, but it is a big issue, and it's an issue as we move into the future in terms of, again, sustainability. That and climate change are two of the issues that I'm most concerned about related to our ability to sustain the progress that we're making.
Sorry, there's two questions that I particularly want to get to in the time we have left. So let me throw these out. And there's a little bit of a precursor to one. This one's from Kirk Havens. And Fred, it starts out being directed at you, but then I think the other panelists can chime in. If your team of doctors decided a specific treatment will improve your health, but you weren't involved in the specific medicine dosage requirements, would you refuse the treatment? I think the important part, as Fred has mentioned, is effective communication. And in this case, as we are learning while doing, the public is informed of what we have learned in our efforts to improve the Bay's health. So I think this is getting to your issue about not being engaged or not being bought into the blueprint. And if we were to communicate our learning while doing, would that help that situation, or would that improve, would that increase the buy-in, basically? If we said, well, this was our best guess, and we're learning, this is how we're learning while we're doing, would that overcome some of that?
It might. Some of that is a little complex because to me, it goes to the question of the difference between turf and domain. Turf being where you're standing, And domain is where you can go and start giving people advice and making the rules. And that value tends to be very different in terms of social power. Most people of color I know their communities, and don't necessarily feel safe going into another community and opining on the environmental problems. Do you know what I'm saying? So you have to start where people are, and people don't always have the same circle of reach in terms of what they're prepared to comment or on or weigh in on. People feel most competent commenting and participating in decision-making related to their turf. But that domain problem is real, actually. And it's a problem with the big greens sometimes, because they look at the problems of local communities as a commodity that might fund them. And so their stakeholder interest isn't already representative of the community always. Sometimes it's really about what they want. How can they brand this issue to themselves? To the community, it's a problem. To the green, it's an issue. You know, something we can, take elsewhere. It's portable. In fact, it's better for them if it's portable. So I don't know. You see what I'm saying? It's a little bound up within this concept of where we're competent to operate and where we can actually have some influence. And that's different depending on the social power.
Yeah. So this is one of the things that I think we're grappling with in the program now, trying to get local engagement, right? So it's really about trust. Kirk's example of the doctors and the regimen, of course, I wouldn't have to be part of that, what I don't know, but I have to trust those that are giving me that advice. And if I don't trust them, I might not do it. And so part of what we are looking at for kind of the conceptual model of how to get down to local engagement is that we really need to find a way to communicate and translate it in a way that we can hand it to a trusted source, a trusted person for that community, so that trusted person can deliver the message in a way that it could be well received by that community. And so, for the doctor's example, I would have to trust my doctors before I would take a pill that my doctor told me I needed to take, right? And I trust it because of the education that they've had and because I chose that doctor after looking at other things. So I think that the trust is a really big issue for the answer to that question.
It reminds me of a starting story in my career was a newly minted PhD and professional scientist advising a wetland board on the appropriate environmental decision-making. And I thought, I am educated, I am state of the art, they will be persuaded by my brilliance. And the board actually did, but the project proponent was a little old lady who didn't get what she wanted, and at the end of the meeting came up and stood in front of me and pounded on my chest and said, I just want you to know that your degree isn't worth the paper it's written on, and stormed out. So I have been working from that base of appreciation and expected respect for the rest of my career.
Okay, let me finish up with a question from Dia Brown, because I think it's really, it goes to a wonderful conversation that's been evolving over the last hour and a half. She says, I am curious about the separation of science and activism. I think they need to be one and the same. What are your thoughts on this, and how do we incorporate the two? Is there a way to marry activism and science?
People do. I know activist scientists. I'm sorry, go ahead, Carl.
I was just going to provide the stock answer from the science community, which is as soon as you become an activist and identified as such, you lose credibility.
And that's the trick. Like I said, I know activist scientists. I think you know some too. I know some that are very skillful at drawing a line between being perceived as activist for something. So it's a tough one, because I think it does kind of tread on that fine gray area between the scientific credibility and objectivity and the willingness for scientists to actually commit themselves to making the change, being the change they want to see. I think that's the struggle. And I think that's a personal struggle for at least some scientists that I know. But I do know, in fact, I know at least one activist scientist I sent you in the chat, Carl, that I think we have in common at your higher education institution. He's very much an activist. So
I know lots of them too, and you can navigate that. It's all part of being a citizen scientist, but it's not a simple marriage or melding of interests.
Agreed.
Karen?
I don't know that I have an answer for that. I think that you can certainly be an activist that has a science background and understands the science and can translate it, and you can be a scientist who has activism and you know, as part of what you do. Does it have to be one and the same? I don't necessarily believe it has to be one and the same. I think that sometimes you need multiple people to do a single job. So how might that look? And does it have to be all one person, or can it be multiple people making sure that that at the end of the day, the science gets delivered in a way that the community will appreciate and use it? And that might take more than one person.
All right, well, we have a couple minutes left. So you have one task left. I would just want to remind people that the next roundtable is May 19th. The topic is riparian buffers and stream restoration. I want to thank the truth tellers on today's webinar, because I was just so looking forward to each one of you individually, but especially the wonderful stew that is the three of you. And so my last question really is from each of you. What was a moment of growth from today's webinar?
I realized that Carl and I may not disagree on nearly as much as we had thought at our initial encounter.
I was about to say exactly the same thing.
And I appreciate that, because I really did want to hear what Carl had to say, but I sensed that he was reticent. I don't want to put words in your mouth. And so I appreciate that we can talk. And I think that's a good place to start. I think we need better conversations in this work. We're all in this mess together. So there it is.
And every time we have these discussions, I have a renewed sort of appreciation for Karen's career. And how she's been able to navigate keeping a program on track with the two voices that Fred and I represent as two of probably a dozen that are constantly pulling in different directions.
Karen and I had the good fortune to run into last week at a TV studio, so we've had more contact actually. Yeah.
And Karen?
I honestly, I learn something all the time. I just, and today, you know, not just learning, but being sensitive to different perspectives. I take, you know, Fred, I've talked to you a couple of times now, and I've taken things that you have said, and really thought about how that impacts my life and what I'm trying to do in Chesapeake Bay. Carl and I have worked together for forever, and for a lot of my career actually. And I take that science to management connection very seriously, as does he. And I think that we learn things all the time. But I'm always learning new things. I didn't know that Carl started out in Annapolis. That was new to me at the EPA lab.
So I will tell each of you that we've gotten lots and lots of comments in the chat about how much they've enjoyed the conversation and the opportunity to hear a more in-depth description of your experiences and how you got here. And so, Loretta is saying, Fred taught me the term MacGuffin today. He taught me the term MacGuffin today too. So I want to thank you all again. I want to thank everyone who participated in the webinar, and we are looking forward to seeing you next time. Thank you.
Thanks.